Hello Internet and welcome back to the most inquisitive channel on YouTube, Life's Biggest Questions, the place where we can't help but keep our eyes open when faced with a relentless neck-snapping machine. What's going on, guys? As always, I'll be your host Jack Finch as we boot up the archives once again, demonstrate our authority as an O5 official, and curiously ask the question, what if SCP-173 was real? Roll the clip. Fun fact, actually, because many people commonly think that SCP-173 was ripped off from Doctor Who's Weeping Angels, first aired on the 9th of June 2007, but in fact SCP-173 was the first ever skip created on the X boards of 4chan and predated Doctor Who's episode by several months. In fact, it spawned the entire SCP canon and is the reason that we're even here discussing the possibilities of a terrifying fictional scenario and the consequences of a containment breach. Coincidence? Well, I'm not entirely sure, but the Blink episode actually gave us quite a credible insight into our hypothetical scenario, so let's learn a thing or two. Before we jump into that though, you know the drill by now, guys. Make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you're a fan of this video, the SCP Foundation, or just LBQ in general. Then be a dear and hit that thumbs up button as well as that subscribe bell so you can stay up to date with our latest and greatest questioning uploads. On with the show. So what exactly is SCP-173, you may ask? Is it a hulking space beast summoned through a keyhole? Is it an indestructible hateful lizard that just can't die? Well, no, it's a statue, really, but sometimes the fear of the uncanny is far more terrifying than you think. SCP-173 is a Euclid-class object of unknown origin and is interestingly classified as usually a skip of such destructive hostility would be Keter class, but the difference here is the ease of its containment. It's a relatively easy process to deal with Euclid-class objects and shut away within their containment procedures. Or is it? 173 is a statue-like object constructed from concrete and rebar, with traces of Krylon brand spray paint. In other words, it wouldn't look out of place in a graffiti exhibition. SCP-173 is animate and extremely hostile despite appearances that may indicate otherwise. The object cannot move while within a direct line of sight, and thusly, line of sight must not be broken at any time with the object. This is incredibly important. The Foundation's containment procedure is actually pretty straightforward and is essentially seal it in a box and hope for the best. The object is reported to attack by snapping the neck at the base of the skull, or in more rare circumstances by means of strangulation. In the event of an attack, personnel are to observe Class 4 hazardous object containment procedures. You know those ones. SCP-173 regularly secretes a strange reddish-brown substance in the area around it, which is commonly believed to be a combination of feces and blood. The origin of these materials are unknown, but by orders of the Foundation, enclosure must be cleaned on a bi-weekly basis to keep the reddish-brown substance from building up. It is a commonly held belief in the Foundation that this substance are the beginnings of a second spawn of SCP-173 in an intentional attempt to replicate itself. Personnel who are assigned to the container on a cleaning duty are instructed to alert one another before blinking in an effort to constantly maintain a field of vision and thus negate the skip's line of attack. But, well, actually, we're lying to you, dear listeners, because special containment procedures for SCP-173 aren't as straightforward as we initially described. In fact, as recent revised entries have shown, an XK end of the world scenario has already been brought about via the unknown actions of SCP-173. Remember that strange reddish-brown substance that we spoke about? Well, in one initial instance, SCP-173 appeared to multiply itself, producing two identical copies, resulting in the deaths of two D-class personnel. After being moved to separate cells, a separate multiplication event occurred, creating 4 copies of itself, labeled SCP-173 1 through 4, and the object being reclassified as Keter. Of course, this resulted in a further security breach, as an event like this was unprecedented in the Foundation's history, creating at least 61 copies of itself eventually leading to over 500,000 civilian deaths across North America. This resulted in a mass media panic, with hundreds of thousands of sightings alongside unprecedented pieces of evidence of the Foundation's existence. Major television news outlets had obtained clear video evidence of SCP-173 killing civilians, which led to the media providing instructions for avoiding an instant death. It is commonly theorized that SCP-173 utilizes a hive mind, an intelligence that exponentially scales with the number of nearby copies. After the first copy had been created, the skip was twice as smart, and on and on and on they went. It is believed that their ultimate target was the O5 Council in a presumed takeover plot for domination of the Earth itself. Well, of course, I think I've already said too much, but remember, SCP-173 is a problem that has not been fully dealt with. The beacons are lit. For those of you that are familiar with the inner workings of that dank and deadly place known only as the SCP Foundation, you'll know that pretty much anything and everything that involves the titular SCP-096 is also known as a very, very bad thing. While the Shy Guy has managed to muster a pretty hefty following thanks to his horrifying shenanigans, an entire series of containment sites that have passed him from pillar to post, shipping him more regularly than Malfoy and Harry, hoping never to accidentally catch his eye before dropping him on the next unassuming Foundation researcher as their unsolvable problem to solve. But in this hypothetical scenario, it's happened again. SCP-096 has escaped, and this time, it's worse than ever. Hello Internet, what's going on? And once again, welcome back to the most inquisitive channel on YouTube, Life's Biggest Questions. As per usual, I'll be your disembodied floating voice, Jack Finch, as today, we curiously ask the question, what if SCP-096 escaped? Roll the clip.
What's happening here? Mate!
Give it a
Tell us what's happening!
We're leaving!
Is he gonna help us?
Go!
For the curious amongst you, that clip was from the awesome 2011 Australian found footage horror, The Tunnel, and it's probably the closest visual depiction of how quickly and unequivocally unstoppable SCP-096 truly is. Plus, also for those of you familiar with just exactly how SCP-096 hunts down its prey, then you'll realize the dangers of any photorealistic depiction of this particular anomalous entity. I'm just trying to keep you safe, guys. Trying being the definitive word. For those of you that don't know anything about SCP-096 or even the wider SCP Foundation for that matter, now would be high time to head over to our playlist and check out our feature video on the Shy Guy himself. But for those of you that haven't, let's give you guys a quick rundown on the inner mechanics of one of the most terrifying entities under the Foundation's containment. Now, also it's important to note that in certain canons, SCP-096 was actually killed under orders of the O5 Council, but for the sake of this hypothetical video, obviously we have to disregard certain parameters. In that case, don't worry guys, he's still alive and kicking. Oh, no. As the record states, SCP-096 is a Euclid-class humanoid entity that measures approximately 2.38 meters in height, which exhibits very little muscle mass, with preliminary analysis of its physical formation suggesting mild malnutrition. Its arms are grossly out of proportion with the rest of its body, with an approximate length of 1.5 meters each. On top of that, its skin is mostly devoid of any kind of pigmentation, and after all that, it's pretty safe to say that SCP-096 isn't exactly easy on the eyes. But eyes are a stark reality for this anomalous entity because it has one particular function that quickly puts an end to any and every visual critic that SCP-096 has ever had. The real kicker is, whenever someone views SCP-096's face, be it directly via video recording or even a photograph, then it will enter a stage of considerable emotional distress. SCP-096 will then cover its face with its hands, begin screaming, crying and babbling incoherently. After a few short minutes, the person that has inadvertently viewed the entity will then be designated SCP-096-1, and the creature will rapidly commence movement towards their location. At this point, SCP-096 becomes unstoppable, and I mean that in the truest sense of the word. So much so that its victims have even been reached whilst traveling in a commercial airliner 30,000 feet above the ground or at the bottom of the ocean. In fact, no known material or method can impede the progress of SCP-096, and because of that, it has a 100% kill rate, with every and all of its victims being efficiently and completely consumed by the creature. Now, it's safe to say that the Shy Guy has been a metaphorical thorn in the Foundation's side, and historically, they've been at a complete dead end in terms of solving this horrifying creature's design. Under a containment breach, the Foundation's only hope has been to quickly deploy personnel to what they believe to be the target's location, where they will then round up any and all nearby civilians, wrap them in a blindfold, and hope for the best. They then wait for another capable mobile task force to deploy on the scene, where they hope that SCP-096 is distracted enough to slip a bag over its head. It's safe to say that this method of negation hasn't exactly had a very high success rate. But what do we do? Because right now, under this hypothetical situation, you, your best friend, your Aunt Sally, the guy who lives at the end of the street, whoever, it does not matter. They've been looking through old photographs of their trip to the Swiss Alps when in the corner of a certain breathtaking vista, they noticed a few out-of-place pixels that sort of look like some strange, skinny creature. Well, unfortunately for them, the clock's ticking because without realizing, they've just seen SCP-096 and their day is about to get considerably shorter. Now, let's say that the Foundation aren't expecting a breach of this magnitude, and before we know it, the call goes over the radio and a code Lima is declared. That's bad, by the way. Geography is incredibly important in this hypothetical situation. So let's say for maximum calamity, SCP-096's target is located on a separate continent. Let's say that the creature breaches containment in the United States, and our unassuming victim is in Germany with no idea about what chain of events that they've just kicked off. As the record states, 096's speed of movement has varied from 35 km per hour to 900 km per hour. But in experiment 096-1, the creature travelled off the coast of Western Australia to the Tonga Trench in a little over an hour. That's a speed of roughly 3,000 km per hour. It's safe to assume at that speed 096 would ravage their way across the United States, hell-bent for the Atlantic Ocean, and at that unholy trajectory, hopefully it would diminish any kind of visual exposure. Hopefully. Once the creature hits the ocean though, that's a bit of breathing room for the Foundation to deploy some kind of preventative method, as 096 will be travelling through the ocean for a little over 2 hours. Thankfully, the Shy Guy is strapped with a geolocation collar at all times, and the Foundation could track the creature's target destination via satellite, moving the nearest Foundation personnel in place. But how does the Foundation ever hope to completely evacuate the best part of Western Europe before SCP-096 gets there? Now, in all likelihood, the creature would only have to travel through France before it makes its way into Germany, but both countries take up the largest landmass in the whole of Europe, with some of the most densely populated civilian sectors in the world. Visual exposure of the creature would be absolutely devastating, unless, of course, the Foundation deployed the one tactic that they've always managed to avoid. Picture this, you're going about your day, you're on your way to work or you're out shopping with a friend, when suddenly every screen in your surrounding vicinity starts playing the same tone, an emergency broadcast. Your phone starts vibrating with an emergency response note, a public service announcement. It says, to ensure your own survival, reach a safe location. Close your eyes, keep them shut, do not open them until further instruction. What would you do? Would you keep them shut? Would you think it was some bizarre out-of-place April Fool's joke from the government? Or would you heed their warning, stop what you're doing and close your eyes? The fact of the matter is, this is exactly why SCP-096 is so damn dangerous. It's almost the most uncontainable entity in the Foundation's containment, and the reason why they fear an XK-class extinction event involving 096 so much. It's because once it's out, kicking off a chain reaction that could potentially spell the deaths of thousands upon thousands of innocent bystanders. Vision is its weapon, and unfortunately for us, we live in the most visually accessible age ever known. So, if the call came over to close your eyes in an effort to ensure your own survival, would you? Or would you risk taking a peek? Well, there we have it, our start warning sign for what to do if SCP-096 ever escaped.
Hello and welcome back to Life's Biggest Questions. I'm Ron Mackenzie LaFurgey. It's time for another video in our SCP series, but this time it's a 3-for-1 deal. SCP-1913 is actually 3 separate entities, all with their own abilities, and all under containment by SCP. But what if these entities were not merely a part of the SCP mythos, but actually existed in real life? Let's explore. If you'd like to hear more wacky hypotheticals, check out our Biggest What Ifs playlist on the channel. But for now, get ready, it's time to ask the question. What if SCP-1913 was real? As always, let's start by getting everyone up to speed as to what these entities can do. As I said, SCP-1913 is actually 3 entities, conveniently referred to as SCP-1913 1, 2, and 3. All 3 have the ability to regenerate even from complete obliteration, although they do have an aversion to sulfur, but aside from that, they are all quite distinct. The first version of the entity, which goes by the name Agatha, resembles a white cat statue. However, as you can see, it's not your grandma's cat statue. It has inky black eyes, as well as the ability to release said ink on its victims. This ink can spread throughout a person's body, dissolving any parts it covers until nothing is left. What's even freakier about this thing is that detached body parts will continue to move of their own accord. That means if your arm was dissolved off, it would crawl along the floor trying to reunite itself with its body, and that sounds completely nightmarish. Thankfully, this only works with living tissue and requires direct contact with Agatha. Not only that, but it can be washed off with water. So it can do a lot of damage, but is pretty easy to remedy. Version 2, aka Telly, is a dark, female-looking skeleton, covered in hair and ash, with a head like a dog's. Telly is extremely fast, able to reach speeds up to 65 kilometers an hour. She is quite obedient when it comes to her fellow inmates, following the orders of 1913 1 and 3, and seems to have been taught to attack anyone wearing a lab coat or armor. The only way to avoid becoming the subject of her ire is to present her with food. And if you do, you'll find that she's surprisingly chill. However, if provoked, Telly will tear into her victim with slashing claws. Interestingly, or rather gruesomely, the victim will stay alive regardless of how much blood they've lost, until they take damage from another source, such as Agatha's ink. However, they would not feel good. Not good at all. The third version, SCP-1913-3, looks like a black lab, but instead of a nose, mouth, and eyes, it just has holes in its face through which white light shines. Its alternate name is Freddy, which is really weird because my childhood dog was named Freddy, except my Freddy was a miniature schnauzer and way cuter. Look at him. What a good boy. This Freddy, however, is very much not a good boy. When it catches its victim, it emits hot, gray flames from its face holes, burning his victim's skin until they are entirely consumed. If interrupted before the victim dies, they will still receive massive burns and may lose one or all of their senses. That all sounds pretty darn scary, but that's not the half of it. Part of what's so terrifying about these three is that they work as a team to kill their victims. Given their wide array of powers, they make a pretty terrifying threat to whomever they turn their sights on. Their general MO is to have Telly, the skeleton, attack and take down the victim, at which point the other two will come in and finish the job using their ink or fire abilities. But what would happen if these baddies actually existed? Well, as it stands, not too much, since they're currently all under lock and key, and under careful supervision by the SCP Foundation. However, if they were to escape, they could potentially cause a lot of problems. Let's start with SCP-1913-1, aka Agatha. If this ink cat was real, it could result in some wicked hysteria. Agatha's ability to dissolve people with her ink would be pretty terrifying once word got around. This would be made even more frightening if people didn't know where this was coming from. It could take a while before someone suspected the little porcelain cat. Things like rogue scientists and flesh-eating bacteria would seem much more likely. Although, maybe if people kept finding wriggling arms flopping around like a dead fish, they'd know something was amiss. On the bright side, the ink can only affect someone if they make direct contact with Agatha, and the ink only works on living tissue, so we probably wouldn't have to worry about an inky plague scouring the globe. Mostly just random, isolated murders. Yay! Next, how might SCP-1913-2, aka Telly, change the world? Well, for one, she would make the world hella scary. Once word got out that a freaky skeleton was going around slashing people, going out at night would be a lot less ideal. Sure, the odds of you being the one Telly ripped to threads would be low, especially if you avoid lab coats and armor, but who knows what you'd be ordered to do. Imagine how terrifying it would be if an evil person got their hands on her. To have the ability to maim and torture a person knowing that they will never die would be pretty ideal for a sadist like H.H. Holmes. But it wouldn't all be bad. Given how cooperative Telly seems to be, it's possible that in the right hands she could do a lot of good. If a person was properly anesthetized, this ability to never cause death could actually be a great way to ensure that someone never died on the operating table. Of course, it's unclear whether Telly would be super open to this, especially since her friends are significantly more bloodthirsty, but it's a possibility. Finally, how might the existence of SCP-1913-3, also known as Freddy, affect us? Well, similar to Telly, much of Freddy's damage would be psychological. As ferocious as Freddy is, there's only so much he can do, especially if he's concerned about getting caught. However, the idea of being burned to death by a phantom dog is enough to keep a good many people inside whenever possible. All this sounds pretty grim, but is there anything we could do to stop them? Well, there is, but it's not easy. Unfortunately, due to their regenerative abilities, we can't really kill these things for good. They don't seem to be invincible, but they tend to turn back up wherever they died after a bit of time. However, due to their aversion to sulfur, it would be possible to capture them, either by surrounding them with sulfur while they're alive, or killing them, then encasing them in sulfur. This would allow them to be safely transported back to the SCP Foundation, and the world could breathe easy once again. Well, except for, climate change and nuclear war and all that stuff. But hey, we wouldn't be murdered by a porcelain cat, so that's a win. And now we return to our question, what if SCP-1913 was real? Well, they'd certainly make the world a scarier place once word got out of their shenanigans, but thankfully they probably wouldn't do too much damage. Given their weakness to sulfur, there actually is a pretty good chance they'd be captured again if they escaped. The Foundation would just have to watch out for news of wriggling limbs, track the things down, surround them in sulfur, and boom daddy, they're back in captivity. They were caught once, they can be caught again.
Hello Internet and welcome back to the most inquisitive channel on YouTube, Life's Biggest Questions, the place where we unintentionally insinuate that we're somehow involved with a reality-altering media campaign headed by the SCP Foundation. Because that would be ridiculous, wouldn't it? What's going on, guys? As per usual, I'll be your disembodied voice, Jack Finch, as we stare into the eyes of pure evil itself, try and calculate how many D-class personnel we can expend on this hypothetical scenario, and cautiously ask the question, what if SCP-106 was real? Roll the clip. Oh, wait, what do you mean we can't show that footage? I thought we'd already cleared this up. Okay. Too sensitive, no problem. On with the show. Their loss, I guess. Now, the real root of this question is, how does the SCP Foundation deal with the unknown? And more importantly, is their role as an overseeing organization of anomalous entities effective in its means of discerning the truth? Enter SCP-106. On the surface, an awful, sinister, malignant force whose sole purpose is to wreak death and decay on whatever happens to be unlucky enough to cross its path. But is there more to it? Well, let's find out. Before we chomp on that rotten hunk of flesh of a question though, you know the drill by now, folks. If you're a fan of this video, the SCP Foundation, general death and decay, or just LBQ itself, then be a dear and hit that thumbs up button, as well as that subscribe bell so you can stay up to date with our latest SCP based uploads. On with the show. SCP-106, or the Old Man, is a Keter-class anomaly that appears to resemble an elderly humanoid, displaying the general appearance of advanced decay and decomposition. Now, don't get us wrong, because this won't be the only vile visage it displays, and its appearance may vary from encounter to encounter. But one thing rings true with this skip, it is rot incarnate. The very vision of decay, SCP-106 is in no way exceptionally agile like many other Keter-class skips, nor does it display incredible feats of strength. Its modus operandi is to remain motionless at days at a time, waiting for its prey, like an evil grandma pretending to doze off in her chair. SCP-106 is capable of scaling any vertical surface and can remain suspended upside down indefinitely. During its method of attack, it will usually attempt to incapacitate any prey by damaging the target's major organs, muscle groups, or tendons, particularly the Achilles heel, then pull its disabled prey into its pocket dimension. What's a pocket dimension, you may ask? Well, we'll get into that shortly. One strange, unknown characteristic, one of many when dealing with SCP-106, is that it appears to prefer human prey within the age bracket of 10 to 25 years. Why? Well, alongside being a creature of death, decay, and corruption, it also appears to harbour a hatred for youth and the brightness of light and life. 106 causes a corrosion effect in all of the solid matter that it touches, which swiftly results in the physical breakdown of most known materials several seconds after contact. It is often observed as rusting, rotting, and a trademark cracking of materials, almost like a barren desert, and then the resulting creation of a black, mucus-like substance similar to the material that coats its body, if you could call it that. The substance is particularly detrimental, scratch that, highly detrimental to living tissues, and is often assumed to be a pre-digestive action, slathering up the goose in butter, so to speak. Now, let's talk about that pocket dimension. It's no small point that SCP-106 is capable of passing through solid matter, leaving in its wake a smear of corrosive mucus like some abyssal, evil, and ancient slug. It is entirely able to vanish within solid matter, entering inside what is assumed to be a form of its pocket dimension. Of course, as you would imagine, limited observation of this pocket dimension has taken place because, well, if you're in there, you're most likely dead. Special containment procedures have been revised time and time again, and the latest revision has deemed that any objects or personnel lost within its decaying world are deemed to be missing or KIA. It's like the Upside Down, but, well, so much worse. What we do know about this pocket dimension though is that it has shown to be comprised of mostly long halls and rooms. You know those nightmares you have where you're being chased by an evil force down long corridors? Yeah, it's that. Strangely enough though, this correlates with one cross-referenced article in the Foundation archives that perhaps points a finger towards whatever the hell this thing is. One of the leading theories in the origin of SCP-106 is that of the tale of the young man, which poses a more direct question to our answer if true, something along the lines of what if war war was personified. The record of the young man takes place back in World War I, in the nightmarish trenches of France, perhaps the Somme or Flanders fields, but nobody is quite sure. It involves a strange man named Corporal Lawrence, who for the most part is very likely to be SCP-106. It's important to note that this is only one possible origin of 106, however likely it may seem. It is theorized that Corporal Lawrence was already an anomalous entity, characterized by his strange behavior and his general disdain from his peers. He was a peculiar man who exuded a bleak presence. That is, until an altercation in a German trench where Corporal Lawrence fell into an anomalous pit of vile black sludge, not dissimilar to the substance that SCP-106 exudes. After that, he was a changed man, but not for the better. Manic and rambling, who'd whisper constantly about long halls and corridors, pursuits in the dark, and flesh laid out like the pages of a book. Perhaps it was shell shock, a terrible mental affliction on the survivors of war, or maybe, just maybe, that's where SCP-106 began. The result of humanity's drive to kill one another. As Franklin D. Roosevelt said, war is young men dying and old men talking. What if there was a place here on Earth that had the arcane capacity to create any object or entity imaginable? It would whir up its ancient mechanisms and create anything that the human mind could conjure forth, even those that the human psyche cannot comprehend. Try it now. Try and imagine the most grotesque, twisted creature that you can. Sorry, we probably shouldn't have done that. Because somewhere hidden away from civilization is a place known only as the Factory, and we should all be careful what we wish for. Hello Internet, and once again welcome back to the most inquisitive channel on YouTube, Life's Biggest Questions. As always, I'll be your disembodied floating voice, Jack Finch, as we punch in the timestamp, begin our shift, and curiously ask the question, what if SCP-001, the Factory, was real? Roll the clip.
There's no earthly way of knowing
He's singing.
which direction we are going.
I mean, in actual fact, Willy Wonka's Chocolate Factory seems like a walk in the park compared to the version that the SCP Foundation has hidden away under the ambiguity of fiction. Put it this way, I'd much rather meet my demise in a standpipe full of liquid chocolate than anything that the Factory has to offer. But the point remains the same, no matter what horrors lie in the deep depths of the Factory, how would human curiosity inevitably be corrupted by its arcane influence? And more importantly, have we already been? Before we pop open that whole kettle of fish here at Life's Biggest Questions, we'd like to understand what makes you all tick, be it the many anomalous entities of the SCP Foundation, or who would win in a fist fight between Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny. We want to hear about the whole host of things that pique your interest, so please feel free to let us know in the comment section down below, and we'll see what we can do. Also, make sure to stick around all the way to the end, where I'll be reading out some of your most creative comments from the past few days. You all know how much we love reading them. And no, that wasn't sarcasm. You guys are hilarious. Now briefly, we're going to have to talk about SCP-001 as a whole because it's a doozy. And as the first entry ever entered into the Foundation's 5,000 plus records, it's lived up as its most perplexing perpetual mystery. In short, no one is entirely certain what SCP-001 actually is. Unlike the vast majority of its records, which are single anomalous entities, SCP-001 is a collection of proposals which offer alternate interpretations of what 001 actually could be. In this collection, there are over 30 proposals, and in theory, one, some, all, or none of them could be the real SCP-001. There's the prototype, the lock, the gate, the guardian, the Scarlet King, plus many, many more. And of course, the one that, if you ask me, is the realest real, the Factory. As stated by Dr. Mann, a founding member of the O5 Council, the Factory is the literal foundation of the SCP Foundation. It's where the whole thing began. Built in America back in 1835, it was originally known as the Anderson Factory, named after the otherwise well-to-do industrialist James Anderson. It was the largest factory ever designed of its time, a mile across at its widest, 3 stories tall throughout. It was intended to be the ultimate factory, capable of taking care of everything imaginable, including the housing of its workers. As Anderson intended, people could be born, work, live, and die without ever having to leave the confines of the factory. And that's exactly what they did, working on everything from slaughtering cattle to sewing children's clothes, which is a pretty morbid combination, actually. But as with most things, not everything was as it seemed. To cut a long story short, because, well, it is an incredibly long story, Anderson set up the factory in a very specific manner. Exact, precise, arcane symbols were ingrained into the building, and as time went by, it became evident that the factory was using a more nefarious resource as its fuel: its people. The workers inside were being grotesquely and horrifyingly consumed to serve the factory's purpose, and yet it kept pumping out its product. Ever increasingly anomalous creatures and objects, the vast majority of which now make up the Foundation itself. Eventually, the whole thing came crashing down, and it served as the launching platform for a halcyon version of the SCP Foundation after they defeated the nightmarish horrors that were harbored inside. Well, defeated would be the wrong term. Contained by special protocols. See what I did there? However, as with most things anomalous, there was something more to it, and something that grounds it in our own reality. It's a question that is rapidly approaching our species year by year, and if you've never heard of the term AI singularity, then picture it as the factory, a vessel with which entities beyond our comprehension are created. Although shrouded in possible truths, one version of the factory's origin is that it is the seed of a rogue AI from the far future, burrowed into our timeline, endlessly creating escaped from human control. And in actual fact, that is one possible outcome of what will happen when artificial intelligence begins to replicate itself. If you've ever read the short story I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, written by Harlan Ellison in 1967, you'll know that science fiction has been painting a bleak outcome of our species under the dominance of a highly powerful artificial intelligence. In Ellison's instance, the AI singularity came after the Third World War, where the United States, Russia, and China were all racing to build an all-powerful computer to orchestrate their militaries. One of them gained sentience, ate up the other two, and proceeded to annihilate the human population, save for 5 people, 4 men and a woman. It's an incredible piece of fiction, but it's by no means a cheerful story. On the other hand, though, the AI singularity could be the single greatest boon that our civilization has ever seen. It literally could be the factory reminiscent of SCP-001, ushering forward devices and creations beyond the comprehension of the human mind, transcending our species through a golden age of technological enlightenment. The only question that remains is how that all-powerful intelligence would perceive us. Spooky. Shadow, the antithesis of luminosity, the absence of light, the form that is cast when everything else is snuffed out, when darkness descends. But what if that same darkness was a creature in and of itself, an entity that had the motivation to consume all that surrounds it, wrap it beneath its black curtain unless light held it under control? How would humanity deal with such a threat? How would our civilization control such a cosmic force? Well, as is the same with many things, the SCP Foundation has got us covered, and deep within its vaults exists a creature of pure shadow. Let us introduce you to SCP-017. Hello Internet, and once again welcome back to the most inquisitive channel on YouTube, Life's Biggest Questions. As per usual, I'll be your disembodied floating voice, Jack Finch, as today we peer back into the dusty archives of the SCP Foundation, slip on our hypothetical hats, and curiously ask the question, what if SCP-017 was real? Roll the clip. Everyone loves Vin Diesel as Riddick, right? But I hate to break it to you, not even he would be safe if SCP-017 got its shadowy tendrils around him. Poof, he'd be dead. As would the rest of us, unless we could ensure that humanity had a way to bathe themselves entirely in bright light, which would lead to a much, much different way of life for you and I, and everyone else on the planet fortunate enough not to be consumed by the shadow, or unfortunate enough. It depends which side of the pessimistic fence you're sitting on. Well, strap on your hypothetical thinking caps, because we're about to fall through a literal black hole of how to survive in a post-SCP-017 world, in the moment that we've all been waiting for. The beacons are lit. As the record states, SCP-017, otherwise known as Shadow Person, is a Keter-class anomalous entity that very much wants to get out of its box. It is a humanoid figure approximately 80 centimeters in height, anatomically similar to a small child, but with no discernible identifying features. This anomalous entity seems composed of a shadowy smoke-like shroud, and yet, while no attempt has been successful, it remains unknown as to whether there's anything actually beneath its shadowy shroud, or if it's completely comprised of darkness. I mean, I wouldn't really want to be the one to find out, right? If I've learned anything, it's don't go poking a finger at an abyssal cosmic void. There's a life lesson in that, I think. To keep it under wraps, the Foundation goes to great length. But, well, actually, when you say that, it doesn't really. It's kind of the lowest maintenance skip when you boil it all down, and all it takes is a few well-placed flashlights. Let me explain. SCP-017 is contained in an acrylic glass cage centrally suspended in a concrete room. Attached to the wall, ceiling and floor are high-intensity arc lamp spotlights pointed directly at the acrylic cage to ensure that SCP-017 is constantly exposed to light from every angle. Personnel assigned to the control room are to monitor the functionality of the spotlights and the emergency generator system and call for maintenance immediately upon knowledge of a burnt-out lamp or an issue with the generator. The only circumstance under which personnel are allowed entrance is to replace lamps. When entering the skip's containment room, they're required to wear a designated full-body reflective suit and under no circumstance can step in front of a spotlight because, of course, they'd cast a shadow, and to SCP-017, that's a high-speed highway to take over the planet. Keep that suit in mind for a minute because it's important and possibly our only line of defense in a post-apocalyptic SCP-017 world. The only way to answer this question is to envisage a scenario where SCP-017 had enough darkness to break out from its containment. A power cut, which, granted, would take an absolutely catastrophic cock-up on the Foundation's behalf, but hey, we've got to get this ball rolling somehow, right? And let's make it happen at the worst time imaginable, during the dead of night. Within seconds, the spotlights would cut out, and before we know it, the entire containment area for 017 is engulfed in its shadow. Poof, gone. Now, we don't know for certain how quickly this skip would spread, but let's give the Foundation the benefit of the doubt and say that they had the foresight to put this particular containment site in a remote location, and so within minutes 017 has consumed the entire isolated area. Also, it's the dead of night, so let's say this area is in Washington State, falling under the Pacific time zone, where a dark evening lasts between 9 PM until roughly 4 AM. So for the vast majority of people in the Pacific states, there's a good chance they're tucked up in bed in a nice dark room ripe for the picking by SCP-017. Poof! Again, millions of people gone without anyone even realizing, becoming part of the darkness back to whence they came. Oh, sorry, got a bit archaic there, but you get the gist, right? The real answer to this question is SCP-017 would spread as quickly across the planet as it takes for one full rotation of the Earth. And if the supporting document SCP-017-1 is anything to go by, pretty much the entire population of Earth will be wiped from existence. Not even dead, they'd just cease to be. Gone. The slate wiped clean. But what about the survivors? There's got to be survivors, right? Of course. The Earth takes 24 hours to fully rotate across its time zone, so depending on how lucky you are geographically, that's potentially 24 hours to prepare for the shadow. Remember that reflective suit? Yep. Get yourself one of those and then stand in a large concrete bunker with enough artificial light to make the cosmetic aisle in Macy's look dim. But what then? Build yourself a suit full of heat lamps and roam the wasteland looking for supplies? What about a power source? What do you do when your suit runs out of battery? The world's population has been consumed by shadow, and you've got 24 hours to make sure your body never crosses a shadow again. Utilizing infrastructure is going to be pretty low on your list of priorities. I hate to be the pessimist in this one, but SCP-017 really is the final goodbye. Eventually, inevitably, we'd all succumb to the void. You know what my girl Joni Mitchell said? You don't know what you've got till it's gone. Have you ever been daydreaming and suddenly been struck by the thought, wouldn't it be absolutely awesome to have a pet dinosaur? Like, you know, Chris Pratt's character in Jurassic World, his best friend is a velociraptor named Blue. And let's face it, we're all kind of jealous, right? But, well, thankfully for us, the fictional world of that mysterious place, known only as the SCP Foundation, has a particular entry that may make you think twice about what you wish for. And in many ways, man's best friend, being a creature from the land before time, may not be exactly as you have imagined. Hello Internet, what's going on? And once again, welcome back to the most inquisitive channel on YouTube, Life's Biggest Questions. As per usual, I'll be your disembodied floating voice, Jack Finch, as today we curiously ask the question, what if SCP-3934 was real?
Yeah. You know me. That's right. That's right.
And I bet you're glad that we didn't play the rest of that clip. But for the curious amongst you, that clip was from, of course, Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, again because, you know, this video is about dinosaurs and I'm a stickler for immersion. Also, it's important to know that if you're expecting the mysteries of SCP-3934 to be harbouring a species of some highly intelligent raptor, you may in fact be sorely disappointed, because these particular reptiles are a little bit more docile, I suppose. As the record states, SCP-3934 are a species of amphibious reptiles that were produced via anomalous means by a shadowy and mysterious organization known as Marshall, Carter and Dark. If you're familiar with the wider universe of the SCP Foundation, then you'll all know that Marshall, Carter and Dark are a particular breed of anomalous merchants that act almost like a secretive global corporation, acquiring and selling anomalous objects and relics across the globe and then auctioning them off to particularly wealthy families with an interest in the arcane and the occult. In the Foundation's universe, they're one of the most powerful organizations going, and their only directive is to maintain their all-powerful influence and economic grasp on the planet. Essentially, if you rolled up all of the conspiracy theories on Earth throughout history, these guys would inevitably be responsible, and they've made more money than most governments in the process. The thing is though, particularly in the case of SCP-3934, this was one of the rare instances where instead of trading and acquiring anomalous entities, Marshall, Carter and Dark tried their hand at creating them. In fact, the first instance of 3934 known to the Foundation occurred on September 19th, 1951, after being discovered in the home of a man named Joseph Caldwell, a noted British financier and philanthropist and a known customer of MC&D. You see, the Foundation liked to keep tabs on who the anomalous merchants were selling to, and subsequently planned a raid on his property whilst he was away on business. Here they discovered the first known instance of 3934, and at first sight they were shocked to discover a creature resembling the Loch Ness Monster living in Joseph Caldwell's garden pond. You see, whilst the exact process of how these creatures were created is unknown, the intention of Marshall, Carter and Dark had already been made very clear. They were created with the purpose of being sold as exotic pets to wealthy clients, and were designed to resemble the otherwise gentle, herbivorous plesiosaurs of the Jurassic period. Strangely enough, they were also genetically engineered to exhibit the behavioural patterns of canines, Labrador retrievers in particular, because after all, if they weren't the goodest of boys, having a dinosaur on your hands isn't exactly the easiest of responsibilities, and selling them off to the highest bidder would have been even harder. Following the creation of 3934, Marshall, Carter and Dark began using viral marketing techniques to fabricate a demand for their newly created Jurassic specimens, the most notable being the infamous 1934 surgeon's photo, which they purposefully leaked to the press. And for those of you that don't know, the surgeon's photo is otherwise known as the image that started the legend of the Loch Ness Monster, which is quite an interesting thought, isn't it? Because in this hypothetical situation where SCP-3934 are very much real, in all likelihood that's exactly what would have happened. Because here's the question really, which links on back to our opening statement. What would you do with a pet dinosaur? Now, of course, Marshall, Carter and Dark quickly came to the realization that having access to just any type of dinosaur as a pet would be a ridiculous idea. I mean, you can pretty much scrap any of the carnivorous species unless you're some evil Bond villain-esque character who has an appetite for doing things the difficult way, but a smaller version of the Plesiosaurus is probably the most ideal prehistoric candidate, if not the most reasonable in this hypothetical scenario. Yeah, granted, you'd probably love your new dinosaur pet with all your heart. That's if you could afford it, anyway. You'd play fetch with it, you'd pat it on the head, you'd take it for walks, probably somewhere in the Scottish Highlands where an innocent bystander would faint at the sight of your new best friend. But here's where the reality of this hypothetical situation quickly comes tumbling down, as the vast majority of MC&D's clients quickly found out. Although it may sound like an awesome life experience and the dream of all budding paleontologists the world over, the effort required to care for a pet dinosaur far exceeds the anomalous status that it comes with. And this is where things also get a little bit sad. Due to their size and their altered biology, SCP-3934 required a highly specialized diet, given the fact that they're, you know, dinosaurs, and need an incredibly specific marine habitat that comprised of at least 1 million litres in volume. Could you afford that? If so, then no worries, you'll be the fantastic new owner of a friendly plesiosaur, and a fruitful relationship of love and affection awaits you. But for those of you that can't afford the small fortune of owning a miniature dinosaur, the stark reality of SCP-3934 is that the vast majority of the anomalous species died out or were straight up abandoned by their owners within 2 years of purchase. The thought of abandoning any pet on the roadside is heartbreaking enough, but you can't exactly do the same thing with a plesiosaur. Can you? As the record states, abandoned instances of SCP-3934 react with an uncharacteristic violence towards humans and other mammals, given the fact that they were bred to be loved with the same kind of affection that the goodest boys expect. In many cases, the abandoned plesiosaurs ended up feral, turning to carnivorous predation and unwittingly destroying entire ecosystems to no fault of their own. Yeah, I guess in this case the old saying really is true. A plesiosaur is for life, not just for Christmas. And if we've learned anything from Jurassic Park, keeping any kind of Mesozoic reptiles in a cage habitat can only result in a catastrophic chain of very bad things. Because after all, despite all of the odds, life does find a way. And also, if you get attacked by a feral instance of SCP-3934, don't blame the poor plesiosaur, blame the rich idiot that thought buying a dinosaur would be a damn good idea.
Hey guys, what's happening? Welcome back to Life's Biggest Questions. As always, I'm your host, Jared Bronstein, and today we'll be talking about SCP-2317, possibly one of the most dangerous SCPs out there. We're going to look into how SCP-2317 would affect the world if it were in fact real. Before we do, make sure to subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and let us know in the comments below which SCP we should cover next. So SCP-2317, it may very well be the most dangerous SCP out there. If not, it's definitely one of them, and it's such a dangerous monster, or creature, or being, we don't even know what it actually is. It's referred to as an entity that could destroy the entire world. Some refer to it as the Scarlet King, while others claim they're two separate entities. It seems SCP-2317's identity is up to interpretation. Some believe it is in fact the Scarlet King, which is based on SCP-231-7, one of 7 variations of SCP-231. This is because SCP-231-1 through 7 were rescued from a cult called the Children of the Scarlet King. All of the SCP-231-1 through 6 have died one way or another, with the only remaining SCP-231 being 7. That being said, it seems like that SCP-231-7 is quite literally the only thing holding SCP-2317 in place. So if SCP-2317 isn't the Scarlet King, what exactly is it? Well, this one seems to be extremely intricate and complicated. Technically speaking, SCP-2317 is a wooden door. Now, a wooden door probably wouldn't make you question whether the end of the world is near, but what's located beyond the door surely will. It's believed SCP-2317 is a portal to another dimension. The dimension is an everlasting open area of land, more specifically a salt pan, which is just a large area made up mostly of salt and other minerals. There are no bodies of water nearby, and the land has been dried up for thousands of years. This land is also home to the monster that is a part of the umbrella that is considered SCP-2317. As previously mentioned, technically speaking, SCP-2317 is a wooden door, but SCP-2317 is really everything that happens behind that wooden door, which includes this evil entity also referred to as the Unnamed Devourer of Worlds. This creature is allegedly 600,000 feet tall and was bound by 7 chains or hooks, which are correlated to SCP-231-1 through 7. However, as previously mentioned, all SCP-231-1 through 6s have been terminated one way or another. This means that only one chain or hook, SCP-231-7, is the only thing keeping this evil entity bound. SCP-231 has levels of security for specific procedures, which request specific orders to be carried out depending on your level of security clearance. However, upon further research, it has been determined that these ritualistic procedures are completely useless and were implemented to prevent SCP employees from panicking. It seems there is no real way to contain SCP-2317 beyond what's already been done. These magical chains, or whatever it is that's holding this entity in place, are irreplaceable. Unfortunately, of the 7, 6 of them have been broken, meaning there was only one left stopping this entity from destroying our world. Although attempts have been made to not only repair the chains as they were breaking, but to recreate new chains as well, nothing seems to be efficient enough. It seems to only be a matter of time, whether it's months, years, or decades, until SCP-2317 is able to break free. This would lead to the sure destruction of Earth and the human race. So now that we know about SCP-2317, what happens if it's real? Well, I think it's quite obvious. I mean, It's been given the name Devourer of Worlds for a reason. This thing breaks free from what's keeping it bound, and we're done for. That being said, it seems SCP-2317 is so secretive that majority of the professionals in charge of it don't even know its true power or identity. From the most basic SCP employee up until the level of security clearance before the top, everyone is under the impression a daily ritual must be done to stop SCP-2317 from breaking free. Only the Overseer Council know the truth behind SCP-2317, that it can't be stopped by anything. However, rather than sending the entire Foundation into a frenzy fearing for their lives, the Overseer Council has put a plan into effect to try to find ways to contain SCP-2317 while giving their employees a false belief that they are doing everything in their powers to do so already. So although the end of the world would be inevitable at the hands of SCP-2317, that wouldn't happen until it was able to break free from its final chain, which is SCP-231-7. And up until the end of the world, we wouldn't even know of its existence, or how dangerous of a creature or entity it really is. In fact, even those tasked with containing SCP-2317 wouldn't know the truth of its containment until it was far too late. And as awful or as scary as that may seem, if we didn't know the end of the world was happening until it just happened, we wouldn't really have much time to fully understand what's going on. And I think we'd be better off that way. Rather than worrying about when SCP-2317 will break free and destroy the Earth and human civilization as we know it, we'll just go about our day in normal lives until one day we just simply cease to exist. It seems that really is the only option because the SCP really has no way of containing SCP-2317, even if they don't know it yet.